Welcome everyone to another podcast episode from Tetra's Fireside Chat. Today we are going to be talking about a really important subject, which is stress awareness in the workplace. And I'm very delighted to have Richard Coleman join us. Richard is a health, safety and fire specialist here at Tetra. He's a dedicated advocate for well-being, mental health and stress awareness. And Richard will be sharing some valuable insights on how organisations can manage and reduce stress in their teams. So Richard, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and talk briefly about your involvement in stress awareness.
Yeah, hi Magnus, thanks very much for having me in again. Good to see you. As you've alluded to, my name is Richard. I work here at Tetra as a health, safety and fire specialist. But obviously within the health aspect, we do have to talk about mental health. We have to talk about stress. And I'm a really keen advocate of this, having suffered from it myself during my time actually previously starting at Tetra. So in the military, I have suffered the effects of stress and I can tell you it's not nice.
At Tetra, we have I think it's 18% of the people who work for us are ex-services in some way. And it's certainly one of the themes we've had in our wellbeing cafes, people talking about stress and particularly PTSD. So it's something that we know is very current, yes. So why do you think stress awareness is such an important issue? Particularly, it's in the focus at the moment because it's Stress Awareness Month. Why is it such an important focus for organisations?
Yeah, so I think with Stress Awareness Month coming around in April, it really gives companies that sort of opportunity that, there's a lot more sort of social media posted around it. But again, when we talk about stress awareness and making sure that we follow what they call the 5 Rs, so, actually reaching out to people, starting the important conversations. Whilst I think it's great that companies or organisations can use this to start the process, it's obviously making sure that it is routine and we don't just do it in the month of April. We actually keep it going throughout the year and we keep running with it. And the same with everything else we do in health and safety, just keep trying to improve the process.
Great. So we're going to make this as practical as we possibly can for organisations thinking about the well-being and stress awareness. So you've mentioned the 5 Rs from the HSE's stress awareness programme. Let's start with the first R, which is reach out and have conversations. Reach out and have conversations. What are some effective ways that organisations can do that with their employees?
Yeah, so I think probably their best bet, if I was in charge of an organisation, I would certainly be using guidance from the HSE's website. They have what they call the Working Minds campaign. And in there, they've got this really useful, what they call toolbox talks. And it really just gives employers that sort of information around how to start the conversation. And I think for a lot of organisations, that's normally the most worrying part because they always think, oh, what if I find out something that I don't like? What if I open a can of worms? Perhaps what if it even causes discontent? Because you may have some employees that think, well, there's not really a problem here, but the minute you start talking about it, they then look a little bit closer and even the employees might think, well, actually, there is a problem here.
So first R, reach out and have conversations. Let's talk about the second R, which is about recognise.
Yeah, so recognition, now this is really quite tricky because when it comes to recognising the symptoms, even some people, and that was myself included when it happened to me, I didn't believe it was a thing until I started displaying what we would call the physical symptoms. But you've also got to think that prior to that, you're going to have, if I just said to you now, the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we act, I'm hoping that that would start sort of drawing you towards maybe thinking about, well, perhaps around some of the cognitive issues. So if you worked with somebody for a long time, for example, so with you, Magnus, if I was working with you and all of a sudden, every time I spoke to you, you'd forgotten something or you seemed to have a bit of brain fog or you couldn't remember, you were missing meetings, that might lead me to go, well, this is not the Magnus that I know because you're always very swept up, very efficient. So I'd just really be thinking there's something amiss here. But also there's other stuff that probably the employer won't see. So it's, I remember when I had anxiety from the stress, I managed to sort of contain it fairly well. But every day I'd be sitting there and in my head I'd be catastrophizing everything. But I also think it's quite important that the employer doesn't see that individual when they go home. So they're not going to see the lack of sleep. It'll only be maybe later physically, like they see the bags under their eyes and things like that, just where they haven't been getting enough sleep.
That's interesting. So I think what you're saying is often in an employment situation, you see the consequences and not necessarily what's kind of driving it as well. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the third R is respond to any risks you've identified. There's a couple of things here. So one of which is about key actions, but how do you know what a risk is? Let's start with the risk element of that.
Yeah, so everything we do in health and safety, it's all about a risk basis. And, we always use the phrase that without risk, there is no opportunity. So I would probably always start off by saying that there is an opportunity here to start the conversation, to start talking about stress. But in terms of risks, it's just things that are going to affect your organization. So, for example, if we have high levels of stress, that means that you're probably going to get people that are more frequently off ill, you will have more grievances perhaps with HR, and ultimately it's not making for that cohesive workforce. So I would probably be thinking down the lines of, checking the data, seeing what's going on, but at the same time, it's how do we sort of combat those risks? So looking at the metrics and saying, well, how can we improve that? And is stress what's causing it?
Thank you. So, what are some key actions that employers can take to address these risks that we've made very clear what they are now?
Again, as I just mentioned there, I think probably looking at a variety of information. Now, when we talked about starting the conversations, making it routine, I've certainly worked for organisations. Some were very keen to do a staff survey and actually find out if stress was affecting people. Because the other thing I guess we need to think about is not all stress is caused by work. I've recently done some work with another colleague from Tetra who's doing a coaching and mentoring qualification. And he actually sent me some paperwork called the stress bucket. And even though I've taught it so many times, I've never actually done it to myself. And it was really quite fascinating to sit down and go, well, what are all of my stressors? What comes into my bucket? And even though there were a few work things on there, actually, some of the things were from outside. But then he talked about the taps and talked about the releases and what do you do to de stress? And actually, yeah, it was a really good exercise. So I think in terms of combating the risks, it's really trying to find out what the problems are, collecting the data, speaking to people, and then just taking sort of positive actions. And I could sort of go through what some of those actions are, perhaps.
Yeah, do please.
Okay. So generally, what we talk about then when we're looking at how to deal with the risks from stress, we would actually start talking off with what we call primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions. So a primary intervention is something that we do perhaps at a more strategic level. So let's say here at Tetra, we've got a stress policy, but we've also got a flexible working policy. So we've already got these things in place, but perhaps if a company hadn't, then they might start thinking about doing that sort of thing. Secondary interventions, now this is dropping down a level, so this is more team management. And for team management, I would probably be looking at things like maybe stress awareness working groups and having the conversations with maybe leadership or management teams in certain areas. And obviously, if we've identified specifically, because here at Tetra, again, using us as a good example, we've got teams that do fire risk assessments, health and safety, but we were talking about it earlier, talking about sales. And if there is something we go, oh, actually, there's a higher degree of stress there because of what they're being asked to do and the demands that are placed on them, then maybe that's where we focus initially. And then the last one, really, the tertiary one, not to be forgotten about though, is where we would look at individuals. So how do we best support individuals? Is it a return to work program? Is it phased work? Do we allow them to, sort of be more flexible potentially because be more flexible potentially because maybe they have to do the school run or something like that. So it's just really adapting our organisation to try and help the individual and reduce those stress levels.
Great, thank you. So, first R is reach out. The second R is recognize.
Yep.
Third R is respond. So, next up, we've got reflect on actions you've agreed and taken. So, how can organizations do that?
Yeah, so in terms of reflection, it's we do everything this way in health and safety, to be fair, so it's quite nice. We call it plan, do, check, act. So on that front, doing exactly the same thing, we are checking that what we're doing, seeing what sort of impact it has, and then we're also acting upon that, because if we found that we've had success in some areas, it could be that we just replicate that and we, maybe push it into other departments. Alternatively, If we find that something hasn't worked, then we need to go away, review it, and maybe come up with some different ideas or solutions.
Great, thank you. Fifth R is to make it routine. So, what advice would you give organizations looking to embed stress awareness and stress actions as an ongoing priority?
Yeah, I think it would probably be remiss of me at this point just not to actually mention that Tetra very nicely sent me away recently and got me to do the mental health first aid instructors course.
Great.
And again, it was great because number one, I learned a lot more about the subject. But number two, it's good because internally we can train people. And I do think just, stress and mental health, they are very intrinsically linked. But I do think that, we could talk about training our people and just generally in terms of making it routine, even if we had an organization that actually said, I cannot physically just fit everything into a month, the advice I would probably give them is to say, well, don't. What I would say is use that month to actually start your planning cycle. And each week when something comes around, say, right, how are we going to start these conversations? How are we going to recognize symptoms? And even if they did that during each week, just had one meeting, then perhaps they could actually embed that during the year going forward. Um, and I normally tell people the best thing to do with any plan is to drip feed it. Because funnily enough, one of the stress management standards from the Health and Safety Executive is change. So if we're talking about we're suddenly going to change our organization, you could actually introduce more stress to people by throwing everything at them at once. So maybe just the drip feed approach.
I think that's a really important point because this is Stress Awareness Month, but it doesn't mean to say it's all in one month. You don't have to pack
Absolutely
it
not.
all in, as it were. This is an ongoing thing.
Agreed.
So, in addition to the HSE program, what other resources or approaches would you recommend for employers looking to improve mental health and well-being in the workplace?
Yeah, so I think from a mental health aspect overall, I would certainly look at the NHS's website. The NHS has got loads of good information on there about, again, sort of working minds, making things routine. And I think probably, charities that are out there such as Mind. The one that I particularly like to mention is one I learnt about from the instructor's course, and it's actually called the Hub of Hope. Have you ever heard of that?
No, that's new to me.
No, and it was new to me as well. But the Hub of Hope is an absolutely fantastic service. So if you imagine, it is the UK's biggest catalogue almost of every single service that is available. And it can be broken down by what you're looking for. So if there was a problem with perhaps alcohol, drugs, anything along those lines, you can search by category. But importantly, you can search by postcode. So you can type in your postcode, what services are available in my area. And I was absolutely shocked. I live up in Lincoln, or just outside of Lincolnshire, to be fair, in the county of Rutland on the border. And I was absolutely blown away with the amount of services, not only your routine sort of online stuff, but actually what face-to-face services there were.
Gosh, I think that's a good point, well made, which is help us at hand probably more closely than you think.
Absolutely, yeah. And I didn't even realise it was there.
So, for leaders and managers who might feel overwhelmed by the topic of mental health, don't not really know where to start or just how to get going, what are the simple first steps that you'd suggest they take to improve stress awareness within their teams?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and it is really sitting down and thinking about almost like a strategy. How do we want to play this out? And again, it is all about starting those sort of initial conversations, reaching out to people. But the important thing, and I love what you've said there, Magnus, to be fair, you've mentioned leadership and managers. None of this will work if we do not have their buy-in. So I've tried to do this myself as a health and safety manager before, but because I didn't have the leadership buy-in, it was, it failed quite early on, to be fair. So even though we got a little bit of traction with it, I think if I just had the buy-in from the leadership and the management, it's just to really sort of, let's just say, put themselves out there. Some of the most exciting stuff I think I ever did during my military career was 360 feedback. I didn't enjoy it at the time because it was a bit like, oh, this is cutting quite deep. But I learned a lot more about myself, my actions, and yeah, just generally, I think it's not fear it, it's embrace it.
Great, I like that. Thank you. This has been a really invaluable discussion. Thank you very much, Richard. Before we finish, any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our listeners and our viewers?
Yeah, I'd just like to obviously say mental health is a really important subject. For those that don't know, the guidance on the first aid at work regulations was updated towards the end of last year to say that employers now need to consider mental health. And again, I'm quite a keen advocate for mental health, obviously because of my past. But as I read more things online, even though we have not had any criminal prosecutions yet around stress, we have had landmark civil cases. And funnily enough, I was reading something the other day. The first ever one was 30 years ago, pretty much to the day, with a case of Northumberland County Council versus Walker, who was a social worker. And they said that they were going to put things in place to support them. They obviously didn't do that, and he went off with stress. It didn't end. When I say it didn't end well, it was a case of they had to let him go because stress had obviously got the better of him. But I just think we are going to be soon in that space where the HSE are going to start looking at criminal prosecutions. And at the end of the day, it's the same as everything. We have to risk assess it, and we need to make sure that people are, putting controls in place.
Absolutely, and also as a leader and a manager within your organisation, making sure that you're looking after your people and that they're not stressed, because that's the right thing to do. Yeah.
Yes, I love it. Yeah, I should have really thought about that. Yeah, what we call the moral component, the
Yeah.
ethical reasons to do it. And I think if you can do that and you can look after your people, that is what I've often told people because my other qualifications are in leadership and management. I've actually said to people that you manage things, but you lead people. So actually, yeah, in terms of leading people and being forthcoming and looking after them, as Simon Sinek often says, people like to be in that safe zone. If you look after them, they will ultimately work hard for you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. If you'd like to learn more, we really encourage you to look at the HSE's resources on workplace stress management. So, once again, thank you, Richard. Thanks very much. And see you again in the next podcast. Thank you.
Thanks, Magnus.